Hello. In this unit, we're going to be discussing one attitude about what we should do if we're not certain about all these arguments we've been looking at about God's existence and what we might do. Yeah. If we're uncertain, what should we do? What should we believe? And we'll be looking in particular at a paper by William James called The Will to Believe on that topic, and in general about how sort of beliefs work and how we should behave in the light of uncertainty. So let's quickly remember what we've been talking about. So we have this traditional conception of God on which God is perfect and infinite, is all-knowing, all-powerful, and purely good. And we saw there's Paley's design argument for the existence of some being somewhat like that, and that it has some problems, that it relies on this idea that only such a being could create the order that we find in the universe, but it looks like things like the theory of natural selection show how there are other possible sources of the order, the well-ordering that we find in the universe. And we also saw Hume argue that actually maybe the world is not so well-ordered after all. There's good order in it, there's also not so good order in it. And if that would mean that you don't need such a good designer. And that Hume's observation that the world is not so well ordered also supports the argument against God's existence, the problem of evil argument. And that holds that the world is less ordered than God would make it, and so God probably does not exist. So I just want to spell that out a little bit in a little bit more detail to remind you of how it goes, because it's going to lead nicely into the James paper. So the problem of evil argument says, first, there is natural evil, and second, that evil is avoidable, and third, that if God exists, there is no avoidable natural evil, and therefore that God does not exist. So the key thing is really, it's pretty clear that there's natural evil, and most people, there's a fairly wide consensus that if God exists, then there's no avoidable natural evil, and the argument is valid, which means that the question of the argument's soundness turns on whether or not that natural evil is avoidable or not on the second premise. So the more sort of confident Hume would say, yes, it looks like there's avoidable natural evil, and in fact there is. The world could have been different with those four circumstances, and if it had been, the world would have just been more straightforwardly better off. And if that's the case, then something like atheism is true, although that would be the very confident Hume saying that in his papers we talked about. He's a little bit more cagey, partially because saying atheist things in his time would have gotten him in a lot of trouble. But then there's the more sort of skeptical Hume, and the skeptical Hume says, well, when we look at our evidence, yeah, it seems like that evidence, if we think about it, probably the natural evil that we find is avoidable, because probably you could change at least one of the circumstances of those four circumstances in a way that the world would be improved. But it's not entirely obvious that you could make such a change and improve the world. Maybe, you change any one of those circumstances and there are sort of a lot of ramifications that we don't know about that in fact would make that change be a change for the worse. And that would mean that the natural evil is not avoidable, that the world is set up as best as it could be. And Hume says, it's kind of hard to tell. That's the skeptical Hume. And the skeptical Hume then says, well, it would then say, if it's hard to tell, what should we think about God? We should withhold affirmation or denial. We shouldn't say God exists, and we shouldn't say God doesn't exist. We shouldn't say either one of those things. We should say we don't know. We should be agnostic. Okay, so and this is the point where James comes in. James thinks that this last move on skeptical Hume's part is a mistake, that skeptical Hume has not really given us a good reason to think that if we're in a position where our evidence doesn't force us to make one decision or another, what should we do? Skeptical Hume says we should withhold affirmation or denial, and James disagrees with that. We can see that I didn't give you a valid argument that says if you don't have strong evidence one way or the other, then you should withhold denial. We didn't get a valid argument for that claim. And James, in fact, thinks that no, some people who are in that situation, who are uncertain, where the evidence doesn't settle the matter for them, some of those people actually should go ahead and believe in God, even though the evidence doesn't settle the matter. In fact, many uncertain people should believe in God. And why? Well, because doing so might benefit them. It would be good for them because it would connect with them with God, if indeed God exists, and that connection, if indeed God exists, would really be good for them in a variety of ways. So that's the basic sort of view that we're going to be looking at. And it's a kind of strange view. You might think, well, why should I believe different claims? Because I have reason to think that they're true. And that's not what James is saying. He's saying, no, part of the reason why you should have beliefs is because they benefit you or because they avoid certain costs. And that's a surprising idea. And so that's what we'll be looking at in the context of this debate about whether or not God exists. So briefly, just to tell you about William James, he's an American. He lived 1842 to 1910. He's sometimes called the father of American psychology, did a lot of important groundbreaking work in psychology and in philosophy in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He wrote a book called The Principles of Psychology, another book called Essays in Radical Empiricism, and another book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And so if you're interested in psychology at all, he lies behind a lot of the contemporary ideas that we have now. Not all of them, but he's a very important figure in the history of psychology as well as a philosopher. And we'll be looking at one of his ideas in this module.